guys, welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you're new. In today's video, I am actually doing the second video in a series in which I am designing a tarot deck. In the last video, I drew the Fool, which I will put up on the screen now, and I will link that video both in the description of this video as well as in the cards. And I had a lot of fun creating that piece. Now, for today's video, I am moving on to what is technically the first numbered card in the Major Arcana, and that is the Magician. Now, before I get into talking about the actual project or this illustration as a whole, I want to talk a little bit about the research and inspiration that I drew from when I was designing and thumbnailing this piece. While I was in the research phase, a few different things stood out to me, and these are the things that I included and reinterpreted in my own version of this card. The first main thing was the idea of having one arm stretched up and the other pointing down. This is pretty common for this card, and I did incorporate that into this design in the form of the pose that this girl is in. I tried to give it a little bit more of a natural feeling, especially for the kind of themes that my particular deck is going for. But I knew that I wanted to incorporate something that was at least reminiscent of that type of pose. Another element that I tried to incorporate in my own way was all of the tarot suits being represented. In the card that I was kind of basing my research on, all of these suits are laying on a table, and I actually toyed around with the idea of having them as graffiti or something similar on this little landscaping bit that the girl is balancing on. But I eventually decided that the way I wanted to incorporate this was as a design on her shirt. I thought about doing pins or patches or something like that, but I eventually decided to just have them as a print. And really the only way that you can tell a difference is the way that I shaded it. Instead of adding the shading as though these items have dimension, I simply added the shading to the shirt. A few other things that I incorporated were an infinity symbol above her head, as well as some general foliage in the foreground. Now, in the card that I again was basing my research on, there are red roses, and it is one of the few tarot cards to actually have roses in it, along with the Fool. I kind of wanted to pay tribute to this idea of roses, but I didn't necessarily want the foliage or background to have roses, and so I kind of paid tribute to them in the form of the tattoos that I eventually gave this girl. I do add the tattoos a bit later in the drawing, after quite a bit of it is already done, as that was a little bit of a last-minute decision on my part. Now, when I compared this card, the Magician, to the last card that I did, the Fool, I found that this one was a little bit easier to interpret into this kind of style. I'm not quite sure why it was easier to interpret, whether it was the fact that I had just already kind of figured out how I wanted to interpret things through the Fool, or if it actually was something about this particular card. But I really did have a lot of fun both conceptualizing it and drawing it. When it comes to illustrations, especially more finished digital ones, research and thumbnailing, especially in reference to symbolism, is really one of my favorite things to incorporate and to really make a part of my creative process. And for me, I think that that makes the idea of designing a tarot deck specifically really, really enjoyable, because there is so much inherent symbolism laced into these cards. And so it's just a matter of interpreting those ideas in my own ways. Now, after I finished this illustration, I did kind of lay just these two drawings side by side, and when I look at them as a series, I'm really happy with the effect. Creating a series of art is a really fun project. It's really something that can stretch you creatively, and this is something I will likely talk about more in a future video in this series. Since there are so many cards to create, I'm sure I'm going to be in need of themes for discussion in those videos. However, one of the things that you will notice if you ever create a series of art is that it can actually be quite challenging. You want the pieces to look as though they belong together, but you also want them to be strong enough to stand on their own. Something else you can often have trouble with is that as you create more pieces and you add more to a series, you run the risk of making everything start to look the same. Now, at this point in my series, I feel as though I have achieved those goals of things looking good together as a series while also standing on their own. However, I'm still only 2 pieces down, and this will only be more difficult as I continue to add more pieces to the series. And these are all things that I plan on keeping in mind moving forward. But as for right now, I'm quite happy with this piece in particular, and the result of this series thus far. The next video in this series is going to be the High Priestess, and I have already begun the process of brainstorming and thumbnailing this particular design. And again, that one came together pretty easily in comparison to the Fool. So we'll see if that kind of idea of me just getting used to the idea of creating tarot cards keeps itself up. But until then, I really hope that you enjoyed this particular time-lapse process. I never really know what to talk about in these digital time lapses, as my process is pretty straightforward. I have a pretty similar process regardless of what the illustration is. So I'm hoping that as I continue on in this series, I will have different ideas for topics and things that I can discuss other than the actual drawing process. But at any rate, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. You can subscribe if you want to see more videos like this or very different from this in the future. And until next time, happy creating!